old lady you see in white way down there, just past that bus. Didn't need my help across that street. That's down there is where I got off at this intersection. I knew I was at the right place because the bus hangs a left. And now I walk down this way. So we're at the bus station. This is our little bus that'll take me to Bran Castle. Very Chinese-like. Okay, I've just entered the very beautiful grounds of Bran Castle. Reputedly attached to or connected with, reputedly connected to Dracula, or Dracula's connected to it, but Dracula is a myth. So who we're really talking about was whatever the guy's name was, the Impaler, known most infamously because he was a great impaler of human beings. That's a whole nother horrific story in history. Dracula is a legendary figure created on the legend that was created around the Impaler here. And that was one designed to make him offensive to the people here, whom at one point they actually liked. This is a pretty building, moss-covered roof. Don't know what it is, and out in front of it is a very lovely lake that we'll get a better look at when we're done looking at the castle, which I just want to do. I wondered why my ni hao for Chinese and konnichiwa for Japanese wasn't working on the Orientals. And then, of course, I finally figured out they're Korean. Another interesting building I'm sure I'll have a chance to explore further and probably have better views from on top. Not terribly impressive so far. But we'll go up. Nothing terribly impressive about the architecture. Is pretty much standard. Who knows how much of this is authentic? There isn't much to see in here if it weren't for the gewgaws they added. Again, the architecture is not astounding. It's the same designs throughout. This is a larger room with big beam ceilings and a large fireplace enclosure, and here's the stairway that will go up, which hopefully adds some interest. It's called a secret staircase, but it can hardly be such when there's this infrastructure, including the door, that give it identification, but apparently it is embedded inside the walls somehow. As we learned yesterday, apparently all castles have secret passageways, which I suspect, rather than secret, were designed for just private access to certain parts of the house when you wanted it. But on the other hand, the Chinese emperors, or the people in their castles, had secret entranceways, as well as certain devices like squeaky floors that give them learning from the incredibly stealth and powerful killing ninjas of that samurai period. These were, again, short men. So here we are in an upper floor and a large room. Again, you must imagine that the wealth that these people had would have filled this room with furniture, other furnishings, art that would have made it a grand place. And here we exit out onto a porch or patio.
Because there is dark. It's not for dark. Nu, și acum cum o să? De ce te mai iei de dănuț? Da. Uite eu cum ți-am făcut-o pe mine.
Some pretty views from up here.
Baby, make me hit picture because I don't like what you make. Make me, yeah, make me hit. Will you press it?
We'll go up these stairs.
Aici. Vrei să-i descrieți?
As I say, there's not much to shoot in here other than what you're seeing. So I figured I might as well do it this way. Then you can see exactly what I see. Resting these little alcoves. And you wonder what that space over there would have been for. This is interesting, was it? For these doors, pivoting doors, were they for tossing rocks or oil outside of? You see, they would go down into there. Guess is that right below these doors, it would have fallen on an entry area. And we step down into this little room. It's a dark architecture. And the wood does not give the elegance that we had at the other cathedral. Or, I mean, the other fort in Sinai, eh? But it may have been the style of the time. But it seems to be a rather utilitarian design. An interesting door exit, interesting relative to the utilitarian plainness of this architecture. Here an interesting little niche. You wonder what it was for, other than it ended up being there. And here a stairway intersection. And another stairway taking us up further. It may be that this was more fort than residence, or at least it had a very strong defensive purpose. We're going down now. If it weren't for the furniture, there'd be nothing to look at. This is kind of pretty. Just because the elements flow together. And maybe because this is the inner area, it didn't require the defensiveness of no beautiful light-giving windows such as this does. I wonder if that were original. At least it shows there was some aesthetic interest. Of course, they could have gained a great deal of aesthetic interest out of the gewgaws that were here. Again, it's the stuff that they fill the room with that we're supposed to be impressed with, because the rooms are not that interesting. Here, a heavy crown and scepter. We're now going back through where we were. These, again, probably providing not only comfortable places to sit for the sun when you weren't at war, but firing positions when you were, although they don't look like it. Some armament that's always interesting to look at. Here, a small room. Oh, a bath room. Perhaps a woman's vanity or boudoir, I'm guessing, with that particular furniture fixture there. Here's some costume. Here's some very pretty garments. These probably are very much the shields and standards that you tried to capture in battle and then display as victors. Here are some more. There's the tree trunk with the roots that signifies the binding together of various communities and or families. that probably is for airflow up above. Or maybe that's what we saw out of that slit. Huh. So I would think this was some kind of a jousting helmet if it's authentic, because you would be leaning forward anyway. And here we are on yet another balcony. This is a defense corridor designed to connect the defensive towers. Say during the restoration, most of the windows became, or shooting windows became, these would seem to have been very, very nice if they were on the outside so that you had views, but of course that wasn't the purpose. We see a better example of how where we are is used. These would have been the shooting ports. You can even see a little bit of Archimedes sloping inward ports. I wonder if this was representative of the size cannon that might have been used. As you can see, the enclosure here is pretty modest, and it doesn't make for beauty or for tranquility. It's defensive. Here is an entrance to an exhibit on torture instruments that requires a ticket that you somehow have to know that you buy beforehand somewhere down below.
Zu Füßen der Burg sehen wir eine alte Holzkirche mit einem primitiven Abendmahlsbild.
I think this is in German, but with Romanian subtitles. The wealthy distributing bread and cheese to the poor, probably using the same resources that they stole from them through their labor. This is probably an authentic version of what I saw today in this parade. An example of the shooting view. These are either original or a copy of scales used to weigh convicts, because the belief was that convicts who were connected to the devil would, by virtue of that connection, be lighter than their appearance would suggest. And apparently it's called putting on scales. I hope I can read this. Procedure carried out in stages. Stripped search for any extra weight. Weighed on an amount judged to be appropriate for their size and shape. Too light, torturing would commence till they confessed. Sometimes they were weighed against a Bible, because if they were heavier than a Bible, then they apparently were presumed innocent and would walk away. Abuse was rampant, of course, and if their weighing was favorable, they were given a certificate to protect them from further accusations of witchcraft. And the court collected money for this inspection, making it a very profitable business, particularly if you were proactive and were found innocent. The court actually had trouble dealing with all the people waiting to be weighed, and there was often a backlog of cases. So as one might well imagine, it was a mixture of superstition, gross colossal ignorance of the times, and abusive fraud. Perhaps a gong warning that we're under siege or attack is imminent. Probably a jail cell. No telling what this would have held. Something. You would think we're in some kind of a tower. Here, of course, a shooting port. Another stairway. Here is interesting, a hole coming out of the ground. You wonder if that was the messenger's secret escape. You can see that on this side it would be a pretty difficult attack, but of course the commander didn't care. He was just sending his men to slaughter. And eventually they would break through somewhere, I guess. Analysis of a fortress like this would have to have been a critical skill, you would think. One of the things you can probably surmise was that if you had to live in a castle like that defensively, going outside the castle couldn't have been a lot of fun. These look like two large vessels with tops on them, but notice that there's a ring around both of them, as though it were a path that animals would walk, like you would see if they were turning a grinding stone. Standing up close, this just does look like a vessel. Cement, maybe out of stone, but I think some kind of cement. This may just be for the planting of flowers. It's pretty, but I have to wonder if it was part of the castle complex at the time. It was an active castle fortress, or is it something that was developed as an afterthought? Imposing as a castle, I suspect, but not even particularly pretty. Don't know what they were actually used for. Now they're just decoration in this park-like area. Did they hold water for fire like the Chinese use? Or was it a vessel, but it does seem to have a hole in the bottom. Also, it had something on top. You see these iron nails driven into it. Okay, we are now in this museum, which is part of the Bran complex, and it is a museum of old buildings that are brought here. I was told about this. It's going to be quite interesting. And these are honey bee nests, if you will, for creating the honeycomb for the miera, which is how you say honey in Romanian, miera. Now notice when you say honey, miera, that R, because it's spelled M-I-E-R-E, I think, is pronounced with a D. It's Spanish because it's Roman, and there are 3 Roman languages: French, Spanish, and whatever the other one is. Imagine when these stoves got cranked up for a while, you kept them hot. They would radiate heat probably all night long. Wonder what that was for. What we're entering into now is what I think we saw at the other one, and this is a home complex that is like a fortress, the wall around it, quite a substantial and high wall in this instance. So you can imagine, you can literally imagine being here. This is where the carriages and animals were kept, I think, is over in here. And I believe this was the house here, if I read it right. But once we go inside, we'll see. Notice these spikes that were driven down and are exposed. Yeah, they held the building together, but you wonder why. Is that just because that's how they were designed, and if they stuck out, they became a design element? Perhaps. First sensation when I walk in here is how cool it is. Notice that large bin furniture, something that would store probably grains or whatever, safe from animals or little mice. I suspect the loom for mountain folk in the heavy long winters was something that made you money, and it was a very useful thing for your family, for blankets, rugs, and the clothing that you wore. So necessitated by their cold temperatures. And a large, spacious room. Notice the large, long benches. That's a Muslim thing, it seems like, but perhaps shared by several of these cultures. Here, a press, since these people weren't raising wine, this was probably for pressing wool into bundles that were small and transportable. I don't know what this is, although my guess is that it's a way of filtering something like grains or whatever through it. But I don't know. A saw, but curious that notice that it saws that way. So perhaps it was used, I don't know, maybe for sawing a beam, but a beam that had already been cut on two sides. Look closely here, you can see that there would be like the hand grips. You can see how your hand would grip it. So one man on either end. And it's sawed. The teeth are only one way, it looks like. Whether it's sawed both ways or not, I don't know. Funky little Surrey carriage. I don't know that this would have been used by mountain folk. This may well have been. And that wagon. Imagine when this was the state of the art. The heavy chains. Notice all the styles we're looking at are styles that involve wood framing probably, but probably the walls are of an adobe or a wattle or something that's covered with plaster. And it could be like that one there, log that's covered with plaster. This house has apparently a hall in it, which it makes it unique. Maybe this mudroom-like thing that we're inside of. And perhaps this central portion here was just a storage area. We're a tiny little house. Room for a stove and a bed, but what more does a man need? Stick your iPad or computer right over there and you got it hammered. Of course, there's a bulky jacket to keep you warm in the winter. And maybe you threw it over you at night. They had access up there for maybe storing things in the winter. But out back, can you imagine living in such sparse conditions? I can. It was a cattle shed, in other words, a temporary refuge. Here another modest house. Notice the upstairs where you would put hay and perhaps other things. This one a little bit larger. Now it doesn't have a bed in it, but it would have. But a little more spacious. Two could live here if you tolerated each other. Notice on that first building there is an oven that I think protrudes from the inside, which would perhaps make it a little bit more practical and safe with all that wood. Now as I pan this building, you'll see looking at the corners there that the building on the left is made out of log but covered with plaster. They're just a separating wall, or a connecting wall I should say, with some kind of perhaps overhang. And here probably the same kind of building, same design, except not covered. And it may have been used for a barn. This would have been something from the 1890s roughly. It doesn't look at all unusual for what you might find somewhere in the west, particularly the northwest. Same with this building, it's a little bit larger. Barn. Here it looks like a barn. Yeah. Was that for feeding animals who were outside? I wonder how many generations would live and use these buildings. They're substantial, tremendous investment. Here we're seeing log, the wood that's been lumbered. They didn't seem to have big, long, straight trees in some areas, but other areas do, like this one. So why such short boards? Maybe the technology of sawing. This was probably the saw structure. Yeah, that is the saw, I think. Probably worked up and down. And the lumber, the tree rolled on this trestle here, if you will, and these wooden wheels. Now you can see the saw there. I hope it was mechanically run. Here's a doorway giving us access into the basement area where that saw was. Now you can see machinery down there, so it was, and they're belt driven, so that means there was literally some kind of machine. Now it could have been water driven, but I don't think so. I'm guessing that trestle somehow rolled all the way, the lumber all the way into here and back and forth. Now that's a substantial looking little structure, isn't it? I wonder what great benefits that investment yielded. And there's no explanation for this little structure, obviously created on an earlier design, but it looks like it is coned in the center. This gives us a clue. It wasn't anybody's dwelling at all. It was some kind of a mechanical use in there. We'll find out in a moment when I look at the interpreter sign. Duh. That's a pretty substantial water wheel. Look at the size of that shaft. Through the screen we can see that that cement deal there was cone shaped and would have been like we saw in the other museum for that fulling and cleaning of wool function. On a bigger bus going back to Brașov, and this one is decorated apparently with I think those are deodorant type devices. Kind of reminds me of Asia, particularly with the curtains. Probably as good a shot as I'm going to get of these mountains. What that complex is up there. Maybe the castle I'm not going to go visit. Kind of a dramatic cupola on this church, which is Bartholomew Church. A pretty interesting design, actually. Here's a big open market I didn't know was here. If I were going to spend much time, I would come here. Here's a pretty girl. We'll get her. Back at the very bottom of, I call it the bottom of that pedestrian street. And I'm just going to pan this intersection because it's a very pretty flower center that they have in front of this majestic building, whatever it is. This is the restaurant I've eaten in last night, and I hope to eat it again tonight, like now. Get a hint of the ambience. Gracious, professional people last night, that's for sure. It's about 7 o'clock as I leave Brasov, the old town. So it's 7:45, we're leaving Brasov for Indulgences. And it's interesting, all the information I could find gave me two trains, one at 6:19, one at 8:45. When I got here, the lady at the 8:45 window said, hey, you can jump over to number 7 and get a 7:45. And so I did. It was interesting, the woman at number 7 window was so absolutely without personality as to be nearly, how can you say it, angry? Not hateful, just you sensed that she was absolutely devoid of any emotion at all. The train is relatively new but ordinary, nothing out of the ordinary really. but very serviceable. These are nice residential apartment buildings. And I bet you it's a strong indicator of how most of humanity lives when it's in cities. Unlike Bucharest, most of these towns so far that I've been pretty well kept and clean. Way in the distance you can see the mountains. I never got quite that close to them, but they're pretty spectacular mountains. Considering how covered with snow they are, you can imagine how high the elevation. And we're completely surrounded by them, I think. It's interesting, amongst this industrial complexes, a herd of sheep. And there are a number of industrial areas that I've seen. And by way of note, it's interesting, in Romania, if you quit thinking about the language as Romanian and start thinking about it as French or Spanish, you see the similarity and you begin to understand sometimes what people are saying. For example, the train conductors in this little town, as we approach it, notice how this is a bluff, and that's where the town seems centered, and on that what looks like a fortress probably being rebuilt, restored. In fact, it sits on its own knoll. So probably this was the end of a higher landmass that just in itself got slightly isolated. We'll see here as we come around the corner. But I'm sure they're going to attempt to restore that for its tourist value. But you can see how it was a forest. Almost looks like that was purposely gouged out there to create a slope. So as we're traveling in a northwest direction, and so to the southwest is that huge mountain range there. And as we get outside of town, or just a little bit here, I'll move it more to the north, probably more like the west. And way off in the distance, I recall seeing, again, more a mountain range, I think. Yep, see it there, just faintly? I'll bet that I have yet to see the spectacular parts of Romania. Pretty little water lake, feature, pretty little pond for this village. Probably has fish in it. Quite extensive too. I imagine it gathers ducks during migration periods. Serves two little tiny communities. It's interesting, all along here is water, and notice all kinds of birds out there. Interesting. What a resource. Although, I'm not sure I see how it's exploited much. Nice little spot. The contrast between our car conductor on the train, a woman, and the lady in booth 7 is remarkable. Our car conductor has a perpetual cherubic smile on her. Just a view of a small community. You can only imagine what a tightly knit life experience this is. This is actually just part of an old village that's been stringing out for probably a couple miles behind us, alongside the tracks of ways. This little house full of people here. Can you believe living in that little ship? What do people do here? This many people. like a huge grain silo in the background there.
Nu dacă ție îți place, chiar pe aceeași ca la pol, îi place și lui. Și l-am... După Revoluție, cred că dacă uitați, atunci aveați. Aveați ceva în
Pretty rolling countryside. As we, I think, approach a village where he's letting them off at their intersection, not at a train stop. This is Romanian service. Here we are in our little train toilet. This is the flusher, kind of maybe. Notice the toilet seat folds down. Here's our little deal. All more than adequate. This is a way of getting ourselves a little bit of cooler air down. Maybe it's stored there till ages and then put on the fields here. That's one of the moments I like the most in travel. topography, and probably the lifestyles, certainly the economics, although this may all just be one component of several in a family or a community. Guessing that wood is still one of the prime heating and cooking sources in these villages, as evidenced by the smoke that wafts up from small houses. I'm guessing we might be slowing down for oncoming train. I don't know what that's for, but it's a mighty big long shed. Some business, and it also has an EU flag outside of it. One wonders what that was for. It's interesting what it takes to get us rolling. It starts off very slowly, and then there seems to be, I don't know if the camera can pick it up, I'm not sensing it yet, but there's like this real subtle little hitch and a get along, but it's pretty smooth right now. Maybe because we're slowly going uphill. There it goes, you felt it there a bit. Trains are amazing, it seems. They haul so much weight. This is a little device for carrying rail. Probably for the purpose of repair. Whether it can carry more than one or not, I can't see. This is Siga Shore we've been traveling through. We'll come to a stop. When you go to the little towns of Siga Shore, what you're really saying is we're going to the little old town. These are all substantial cities we've been in, with the exception of Sania. Love it when they preserve these old trains. Imagine the work they did, the dreams they fulfilled, and the agonies. How many soldiers hauled off to war from here, never to return?